بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Thank you so much for being here, whether you're here in person or online. This is the monthly mental health awareness series by NAMCC. If you've never heard of it or if you don't know what it is, this initiative was started by, I think, the local leadership as well as psychiatrists and therapists in the Austin Muslim community, just as a way to draw in some more relevant topics specific to mental health. I believe it started in late 2021 or so, and alhamdulillah, this takes place every month on the third Saturday of every month at this time. And this is the first in-person session, so it's a little bit experimental. So for those of you in person, thanks for being here. And today our topic is religious trauma. There we go. I think Imam Jawad was supposed to be here. I don't know if he might pop in at some point, but the Imam will be here if you have questions at the end or want to ask him questions just because of the sensitivity of this topic. We do ask that there's no interruptions or questions until the very end. And again, if the Imam is here, then he would be really valuable to also speak with or just to hear his perspective as well. But just a general content warning, the material in this presentation is sensitive and may cause some distress. So please take care of yourselves as necessary. And remember that questions are okay, but hostility, in any form is not. And with sensitive topics like this, sometimes that tends to bring up a lot of feelings, and that's okay. But we want to deal with it as best as we can, and being respectful to everyone in the room. So a quick background about myself and why I'm even here, or why I'm even here to talk about this particular topic. So again, my name is Sara Bawani. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I have lived in Austin on and off for about the last 10 years or so. I graduated from UT Austin's Master of Social Work program, and I've been doing therapy almost 6 years as a fully licensed professional, 8 years including my time as a student. As a therapist, I work mostly with Muslim individuals on depression, anxiety, trauma, religious and cultural identity, and a lot of different other things as well. But aside from that, I'm also the director of case management at an organization called FACE, which stands for Facing Abuse in Community Environments. And the mission and initiative that FACE is really driven to work towards is combating leadership and clergy abuse in the Muslim community through a number of different initiatives. But a big component of what we do is also education and preparing and preventing leadership abuse from happening in the first place. Also means having proper processes, policies, and procedures in place. And so not only do I do that, but I also work with survivors and victims of clergy and religious abuse and just of spiritual abuse in general. I came into this field, wanting to work in domestic violence, and so I kind of touch each of those topics a little bit in this work. And then finally, I'm also a chapter ambassador for MAPS Austin, which is the Muslim Association for Psychological Services. And it's a directory of licensed Muslim therapists in Texas. And I, kind of help with the Austin chapter. It's not a private practice, but if you ever need a therapist that's Muslim or are looking for a therapist, that's probably the best place to go, at least for those based in Texas. So why this topic? Let me fix this. So this topic is necessary. Whoops. Just because awareness on clergy abuse, spiritual abuse, etc., have arisen explosively over the last 10 years. It is by all means not a new issue, but one that has slowly been addressed in various ways by members of the Muslim community. Community education is really important, and so that's one of the reasons I really wanted to talk about this and do a quick presentation just to cover the absolute basics. So what this presentation is and isn't. So it will be a very brief overview touching many different topics related to clergy abuse or spiritual abuse or religious trauma, kind of touches each of those. We'll also talk about what it may look like specific to the Muslim community. It'll also very briefly discuss the culture of silence around abuse and disclosure with a brief discussion on the religious topic of satr, if you've heard of it. And then also it'll discuss ways to respond and heal from religious trauma, both on an individual level as well as on an as a community level. What this presentation is not is a discussion of specific instances of religious leadership abuse. It is also not a condemnation of Islam or religion or its leadership in any way. And it is not an in-depth discussion on domestic violence. Assalamu alaikum, Imam Jawad. Okay, so just very briefly, to define what religious trauma is. Religious trauma occurs when a person's experience with religion is stressful, degrading, dangerous, abusive, or damaging. Traumatic religious experiences may harm or threaten to harm someone's physical, emotional, mental, sexual, or spiritual health and safety. Um, just waiting for the next slide. There we go. Oops. Okay, so here's just some relevance to the Muslim community again of why this is a really, really important topic. Sound like um, and as you can see above, this is supposed to come like one at a time, but I didn't realize I wouldn't be handling the way that these come about. But these are just many ways that religious trauma can show up in the Muslim community specifically. So, for example, sexual assault by a religious leader, secret marriages between a leader and a congregant or student, something like saying or claiming that God spoke to the perpetrator and commanded them to do X, Y, and Z. And I don't want to go through the whole list, but you can kind of see the extensiveness of, the problem and in the really horrible ways it shows up. Again, using Islam as a way to justify these horrible actions. And I want to emphasize that I'm not making this up or these are not unfounded examples. Every single one of these happens on a very elevated level in our community. And it's really unfortunate. And again, it's just one of the reasons I'm here to sort of, very briefly like give an overview about this issue. In my work with FACE and even as a therapist, I've encountered hundreds of survivors of these particular problems. Nearly all of them are still Muslim, but many have actually been in therapy for many years. And the trauma that comes about from experiencing one or more or even others of these has actually changed their relationship with Islam and changed their relationship with the Muslim community, and oftentimes in ways that wouldn't be traditionally acceptable. And this is not just because of the trauma or the abuse itself, but especially because the people they trusted in the Muslim community shamed them or didn't believe them. And this kind of trauma can be perpetrated not just by a religious leader, because I think that's sometimes how we tend to think of spiritual abuse, but can also be perpetrated by an abusive parent that uses religion to control their child. It can also be perpetrated by an abusive spouse that uses it as a way to control their partner. And again, we'll get to this in a little bit, but you know, spiritual abuse and clergy abuse and all these like really buzzwords have such a bad rep, again, because they take something really sacred to each of us, which is our faith, and which is often practices in our faith which are good, like prayer or fasting or wearing the hijab, but turns them into something that becomes something that is very difficult for someone to feel forced into, believing or practicing. And again, we'll get to that in a little bit. The trauma also has religious implications, which again hits very deeply at the core of something that is sacred to all of us, which is our faith. And because these things very much have to do with someone's faith, the effects of the trauma are processed through the lens of someone's religion, so Islam. Again, for example, someone going through a divorce may feel pressure from their faith community or leaders to work harder, make unwise compromises, or even tolerate abuse to keep the marriage from dissolving. And I literally, as I was sitting here getting ready for this presentation, I got a message about somebody in our community who went through a divorce, someone who was physically abused and assaulted, and imams in not this community, but a different community that I know of, didn't believe her, didn't take her side, and she presented physical evidence. And again, even though the abuse that she encountered was physical, had very much to do with an interpersonal relationship, that added layer of these imams not believing her and siding with her abusive ex-husband, with all the evidence presented, adds another layer of trauma to what she's already experienced. Again, another reason why it's so important to see this from a religious lens. And then finally, again, if a religious community ostracizes a victim of a trauma, claiming it was somehow deserved or decreed by God as necessary, or maybe not that bad in the grand scheme of things, again, this adds another layer of trauma that the victim may experience, which may cloud their perception of religion and, move them away from it at the very end, which again is not something we ever want. And a really big responsibility we have as a community to prevent that from happening. Next slide, please. There we go. Thank you. Okay, so this is just a little, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this is kind of modeled after the power and control wheel. So if you're familiar with domestic violence, there's many different models of kind of the components of what domestic violence may look like. And so the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence made a specific one for spiritual and religious abuse. Not all of it will be entirely relevant to our community, but a lot of it really is. So for example, prolonging abusive relationships or asserting authority by misusing scripture, controlling sexuality and reproduction, like forcing, for example, forcing a spouse to have multiple children against her will. Again, having children, not a bad thing, but being forced to have children against your will, that is again where the piece of abuse comes in, and where the piece of, religion becomes really warped for the victims and the survivors. Again, blaming the victim or saying that it's, decreed by Allah that this person stays in an abusive relationship and marriage, again, adds to the layer of a trauma that a victim or a survivor may experience. And when talking about, spiritual abuse, and I say these words separately because they all mean different things, but religious trauma, spiritual abuse, clergy abuse, I want to emphasize that my specific expertise is in clergy abuse and, leadership abuse by religious leaders. But what we're here today to talk about is just kind of this issue overall from a mental health perspective. So for just the new people in the room, I wanted to clarify that this is not a presentation specific to domestic violence. This is not specific to targeting, any religious leadership or talking about specific instances. It's very much like an overview touching the issue of religious trauma and the different ways it shows up either in families or in leadership. So I want to also point to this study by the ISPU, which is the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, which is a very esteemed research institution, I believe specific to the Muslim community, and does research, very, very thorough research on the Muslim community about the issue of sexual advances from faith leaders, and how prevalent it may be across different faith groups. So as you can see, this is not a problem relevant only to the Muslim community, but the specific issue of sexual advances by faith leaders that are unwanted has mostly been equally prevalent across all faith groups. And as with most of these studies, they are often underreported. I don't have off the top of my head the number of people they surveyed in each of the categories, but with Muslims, it was about 8% of the people they interviewed either had this happen to them or to someone they know. In the Jewish community, it was 10%, in the Catholic community, 11%, in the Protestant community, 10%. And so the lesson to pull from this particular study is that as much as it is sometimes, again, really sensitive to our own community to think that this could possibly happen with something as sacred as, the Quran or these texts and scriptures that we hold so holy, people who will abuse, unfortunately, are born into and exist across every religion. And even outside of religion, you will have people using all kinds of ways to commit harm, whether or not they are part of a particular religious group or not. The year is 2019. Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, so I can get you that number after if you want. I don't know why it's not actually on here, but I believe, yeah, this was done in 2019. And I also want to add, well, maybe I'll get to it in a minute, but yeah, no, I'll get to it in a minute. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So power and control. And sorry, I'm gonna try to speak loudly. If you want to move closer, feel free to move closer, but it's because it's a little bit loud. Thank you. So again, I've been doing this work in religious trauma for about 5 years now, officially. And something I've noticed in my time working with the Muslim community is this deep unawareness of the concept of power and control. So I'm going to try to explain it a little bit here. So for example, if we think of our most esteemed professions like doctors, dentists, therapists, people who are in a helping profession, as soon as you begin a relationship, a professional relationship with a patient, you have created a dynamic of power and control where you have a large amount of power over this person regarding what medications they take, what decisions they will make regarding their health, and what you prescribe them, what you diagnose them with. This creates, a dynamic of power and control. That's inevitable, especially in any kind of helping profession. And the same thing happened. A mic? Yes, that actually would be a good idea. Or not. Yeah, no, it'll be okay. Thank you. The profession of religious leadership at the moment in the United States doesn't currently have a particular licensing body, right? Just as in the same way, for example, a medical professional has a medical board that they report to. I, as a therapist, have a therapeutic board that I report to. If I strike up a relationship with a patient, like a romantic relationship, I would get my license revoked and removed forever. Like I could never practice therapy again, right? It's the same with a doctor. And there are different rules according to different types of professions. But it's that level of seriousness that exists that it's even in the laws of our country and of of each of our individual states that, you're mandated under a certain body to prevent these things from happening. There's checks and balances in place. Right now, our profession of religious leadership doesn't have that. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit because there has been a push to create something of that sort. But again, when power and control in that way goes unchecked, whether it's with leadership, whether it's within a spousal setting, whether it's within a family setting, you have that dynamic of power and control that can unfortunately be easily exploited. Our community is also very insular. We're still very new, and unfortunately, we're not very organized. And so even our processes and procedures are not really in place yet to fully be on the prevention side of this from happening. And again, I'll get to that in a little bit. We also have a really big reliance on our religious leadership, which is really important because our religious leadership hold a very, very special place for the Muslim community, that they are often turned to not just for regular Islamic issues, but also for mental health issues, sometimes for medical issues, sometimes for things regarding family support and children. And so again, when you have all these dynamics, and then you add, some of the other points at the bottom, for example, the concept of creating cult personalities, which I'm really going to gloss over because that's a whole separate topic. But not just, the creation of cult personalities, but also unchecked internet etiquette and access. All of this together has created, some people will say this new issue of clergy abuse or spiritual abuse, but it's never really been new. It's escalated in the way that people understand it and in the way that people are trying to deal with it. But the important thing to highlight is that, again, all these factors and all these dynamics create a collective trauma for the community, which is very evident when another person discloses publicly online that they were abused by a well-known or well-loved religious leader, or that someone comes forward about a violent relationship they were in, where someone used the Quran to control them and it damaged their relationship with Islam. So the key point to take away about power and control is that it causes damage and trauma to someone's mental health, and it causes harm to the religious institution overall, which again is not the goal, because as practicing Muslims, is we're sitting here in a masjid, like we care about our masajid, we care about our religious leadership, we care about our imams, and we care about the people and the congregants who also come to learn from these people. And so we want to make sure that we understand power and control a little more effectively, because that's going to help us on the prevention side of things and how to prevent power and control from being unchecked. So, thank you. So I want to also focus on religious trauma and how it may show up in marriages, for example. So for example, it generally would be enforcing certain practices on your spouse, whether they are religiously sound or only culturally sound. And an example would be being forced to wear the hijab, not being allowed to work, being forced to have multiple children, being forced into intimacy, and doing all of this, misusing or citing false sources. And again, I'm saying this a million times because we're in a masjid and I don't want anyone to think that like I'm saying any of these things inherently are bad. I'm a hijab wearing woman. I've worn hijab for like 15 years. I believe in the hijab. Hijab is very important to me, but there's a very big difference between someone choosing to wear the hijab on their own and being forced into it in marriage, right? Not being allowed to work, for example. Someone can choose not to work if they don't want to, but if they are forced to not work and that is against their will, this is not an Islamic practice. This is something that someone might have manipulated and used a very out of context statement about the Prophet's wives, for example, into saying that their wife is not allowed to work and that's their rule because they're the husband. So again, we're talking domestic violence and an emotionally abusive marriage, but again, it has that spiritual abuse component to it. Being forced to have multiple children, being forced into intimacy, having children, intimacy, none of these are bad things. But when you're forced into it against your will, and a Quran verse is thrown your way of like this is why you should be doing this, it creates a resentment. And this is what I see all the time with survivors of this abuse. It just creates a resentment with the Quran, with the Hadith, with the Prophet, with Islam in general. And you end up having people who either leave Islam permanently, or who leave it temporarily or just really, really struggle with it. And to emphasize, the enforcement here is what leads to the harm. Okay, next slide. Thank you. And then religious trauma and maybe in masajid or institutions. How this can look is if the authority of a leader or of leadership of an institution is absolute, meaning they can't be questioned. You can't access financial records, which, for example, most masajid are nonprofits. You're supposed to be able to access their financial records. Most of us donate to our masajid. We are supposed to be able to see what our donations go to. And unfortunately, a lot of institutions don't have structures in place to allow for that information to be public. But again, this causes a lack of trust. This causes harm. And this causes people to leave their masajid. And again, speaking from experience of seeing this happen in various communities around the country. So no checks and balances for power and leadership, whether it be boards, whether it be where the zakat money goes, whether it be the imam or the resident scholar, or even if it's that really headstrong masjid uncle volunteer who everybody loves, but like doesn't have a formal position. Again, that's where like having formal processes, procedures, etc., come into handy. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But just overarching, when the priority of institutions over the most vulnerable happens, this is against the prophetic model. And I have this hadith at the bottom that we use sometimes in my work, and I really love it. And it says, Abdullah ibn Umar reported, I saw the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, circling the Kaaba and saying, how pure you are and how pure is your fragrance, how great you are and how great is your sanctity. By the one in whose hand is the soul of Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the sanctity of the believer is greater to Allah than your sanctity. And this, I forgot to write the source, but this was on Abu Amina Ilyas's website, and he posts a lot of hadith. And he's, I believe, a religious scholar, but he posts a lot of hadith, I believe, that are kind of like lost to the masses, that he finds in, books of fiqh and things like that. And so this is where this was pulled from. But the general interpretation of this is kind of what I mentioned above, is that the priority of institutions, even the Kaaba, according to this hadith, will never take priority over the believers, and especially of the most vulnerable. Next slide. There we go. So again, sorry for the big wall of text. It was supposed to come all at once. But I want to also talk about the effects of religious trauma on mental health very specifically. And I'm not going to read all of this, but one thing to remember is that trauma of any kind physically changes your brain chemistry. And in very simple terms, if you think of your brain like a computer, and you think of your memories, your experiences, your thoughts, your feelings, etc., like wires coming out of a computer, trauma will snip those wires. Like it actually makes those connections cease to exist. And so when someone is reeling from the after effects of trauma and a lot of bad things are happening to them, or they're not able to fully process what's going on, or they have severe depression, anxiety, nightmares, these are all signs of trauma. And what therapy does is it puts those connections back together. And so, telling someone to move on or to just pray to God, and that's very, very important, but saying like acting as if this is the only thing that needs to happen, is not always helpful and can also sometimes cause more harm. But true help, a lot of time, a lot of therapy, can help someone recover from the effects of emotional trauma. But the way that this can show up in a mental health space, in a therapeutic setting, looks like this: impeded development, poor decision-making skills, lack of self-confidence and self-esteem. And I especially see that one a lot because, and again, it's much deeper, right? Because it's not just about someone's self-confidence, it's about their confidence in the eyes of Allah. Like that is what has been damaged when you add the spiritual component to it. And that's really, really hard to recover. And really hard for, unfortunately, someone to find support all on their own unless they get professional help for it. Okay, next slide. Thanks. So all of this, again, we're asking, is religion the problem? No. It is a misuse of religious texts and doctrine to harm others that is the true problem. And as we've mentioned over and over, this can happen outside of religion. This can happen with other religions. People who will want to abuse and harm will take whatever it is that they can, to justify their behavior. But the final point here on this slide that's really necessary is that the involvement of imams and leadership in combating this issue is absolutely crucial and necessary. Whether we talk about religious trauma in the home or we talk about religious trauma in the masajid, this work was never meant to happen without our imams and leadership, and it's actually meant to be done in conjunction with them. And it's important that they know what's happening, so that they can preserve their profession, because I think all of us want to as well. Islam also has a lot to say about this, especially in light of abuse and sins that cross over into crimes, which would be harming others. So we're going to talk about that next. And I want to emphasize, I'm not a religious scholar. I'm not classically trained in any way. But this information I'm pulling from a credible source called Kerama, which is Muslim women lawyers. And this presentation and this particular part of the actually, I think you went too far, Brother Ajaz. Can you go back 2 slides? There we go. Yeah, I was going to say this part of the presentation has been is on our FAQ page and has been approved by various religious leaders. So I'm going to try and explain it as best as I can. But there's a concept in Islam called satr. Have y'all heard of satr before? No? Satr is an Arabic term that means to cover or protect one's privacy. Refers in the context of social behavior to being discreet about one's own sins, which means keeping one's life, especially one's sins, private, and lowering the veil of discretion or privacy over the shortcomings, flaws, or sins of others, as opposed to exposing them to the public eye or reporting them to the legal system. For example, someone has a drinking problem, covering their sin would be you don't sit there and expose them on social media. I mean, why would you do that? But that is what satr applies to. Where it has been misconstrued, and we can go to the next slide now. There we go. Again, sorry for all the text. But this concept has actually been misunderstood in the Muslim community to allow for abuse to not only continue, but in a way that also condones the abuse in some way. And this causes further harm when victims come to leadership or trusted individuals asking for help. And in essence, it's being condoned by telling the victim to be patient or worry about their spouse's reputation, which is a really disturbing one. And what that's going to translate as is, even if Islam doesn't actually say this, the fact that a religious leader is telling someone that will mean for them in their mind that Islam condones this, right? And it is very hard we have to remember, it's very hard for victims to separate a religious leader from Islam because they consider them an authority on this subject, which is why it's important for us to be extra diligent when dealing with those disclosing abuse or harm. If you don't know what to do, the least you do is not tell them to be patient and deal with it. You maybe refer them to a professional. But at the least, the thing that's the most disturbing that we hear is this idea that you're going to ruin the reputation of your spouse. Like, think about, what he's going to go through if you tell someone that he's beating you throughout the marriage. And again, this is where satr doesn't apply. So I'm going to read this sort of read the second paragraph, which Ibn Hajar comments on, this misconception of what satr is. And he says, it means a situation where someone witnesses something bad or wrong and does not disclose it to other people, but it does not mean abstaining from vehemently reprimanding the offender in private. This also involves testifying against the offender when reprimand and advice fail to work. It appears, therefore, that satr applies to past sins, while reprimand and advice apply to flagrant or present sins. However, if the sinner does not refrain, then it is one's responsibility to report the sinner to the ruler. And this is from back in the time. But what it basically would apply to now is you either report to the authorities or you report to their institution that they work at, because somebody who, whether they're a volunteer or in whatever capacity, who is, and sorry to be really blunt, but if you're beating on your wife at home, you probably shouldn't be here at the masjid preaching or, just being at the masjid and volunteering, because there's much greater problems at home to deal with. An example of this is if you are walking down the street, just anybody, and you witness a murder and you are asked to testify, you are not required by Islam to sit silent and opt out. This is sometimes the extent that we take this concept of satr to, is that was his private sin, he murdered someone, we don't say anything because we want to cover their sins. And that sounds really absurd, right, when I say that out loud, but this same kind of logic is applied to abuse, whether it's physical, sexual, emotional, spiritual, even financial. And And Islam does not require us to sit silent and opt out, because this would actually be against the divine justice of Allah. Because someone was harmed, someone's rights were taken away, and in that instance, Satr doesn't apply. And harm to a person is harm regardless of something that escalated or something that turned into abuse. And next slide. One back, please. There we go. Thank you. And so again, not going to read all this, but this is from Karama, and they have a really, really great article about this whole topic of Satr that I'm going to give you all the title for at the end. I really recommend reading it, but most of this was pulled from that. Jurists will set very strict criteria for practicing Satr, so they involve like all the stuff at the beginning, like the sinner offense is not in the making and could be prevented. The sinner has not already disclosed the sin to himself. But what is really important to get from here is those last 2 points, which are underlined, but that Satr is limited by a victim's rights. So if an act of Satr perpetuates an injustice done to the victim, then it is prohibited, meaning that Satr is prohibited, which means you disclose it and you get help. Furthermore, the person who covers for a wrongdoer is an accomplice in the crime of violating the victim's right. And that means that when the sin violates the rights of other people, whether that be sexual abuse or domestic violence, it is no longer just a sin. It becomes a crime that has to be addressed in a way that restores the right of both the victim and society at large. And again, why are we talking about this? Because this is like, going into sort of a different territory. But you can't really ever talk about sexual violence or domestic violence or even religious trauma without talking about disclosure. Because a lot of what will prevent survivors and victims from getting help, from telling their family, from telling their local imam, is exactly this concept that has been misunderstood. And so I always will talk about these hand in hand, because it's really important to recognize that Satr is about private sin. As soon as you violate the rights of someone else, Satr does not apply anymore. And these are just some of the Quran verses and Hadith that sort of back this up. Again, not a religious scholar, but a lot of this is very plain to me as someone who works in the field, and plain to me just as a Muslim woman who deeply believes in the divine justice of Allah. I can't fathom, the fact that people actually think Islam tells us that we have to hide the horrible things that happen to us behind closed doors. That's not Islam, that is culture. And in the Quran and Surah Nisa, ayah 148 says, Allah does not like the public mention of evil, which we'll quote a lot, by the way. Like, we hear this a lot. We don't like the public mention of evil, but we always leave out the second part, which is except by one who has been wronged. And ever is Allah hearing and knowing. And then the second one, from Surah 42, is that Surah Shura, I believe. There is no blame on those who enforce justice after being wronged. The blame is only against the ones who wrong the people and tyrannize upon the earth without right. Those will have a painful punishment. And this last one is one of those hadith that, like, again, I think is not very commonly known, but was pulled from some very prominent fiqh books. I can't remember which ones at the time. But Ibn Hajar al-Haytami writes, it is obligatory for a person who is aware of a negative quality found in another person to warn others, because this is part of the well-wishing, which is binding upon all Muslims. And the rest of that you can read on your own. But yeah. And let's go next. Okay. Again, now we're kind of moving into response and how we can help. So this is like a Muslim community response wheel that was created by interfaithpartners.org and a little initiative called Pieces of a Bigger Picture. And they have these little wheels for, I think, all different religious groups. So I don't know if this is specifically created by a Muslim person, but I really thought it was helpful to begin with, just for everybody to kind of utilize. And it's primarily, again, for domestic violence, but much of this has overlap with religious trauma or spiritual abuse. So just to sort of read in order, developing protocols, it says to help domestic violence victims, but if we talk in domestic violence victims and in domestic violence spaces or spaces of religious institutions, one of the biggest problems with prevention is just not having structure in place of how to deal with it. Every single time that we get a report at FACE for someone who's committed like a really, really major harm, people are running around like, like chickens with their heads cut off and just don't know what to do. And it's like, do you have a code of conduct? What do you do when someone discloses sexual abuse or trauma? What are your protocols for investigating whether this happened or not? Just the very act of having these things in writing and having people who actually will abide by these, can oftentimes do more, not to prevent the abuse from happening in the first place, but again, preventing the further trauma that happens when there are no processes, the victim is not believed, the victim may be shamed or ostracized. All of this can be prevented just by having protocols in place. Creating a safe haven, so making your masjid a safe place where victims of abuse can ask for help, letting the community know that you're prepared to provide support, teaching through life experiences, educating the community, which is why we're here, working as a team. And one of the ways that I know a lot of masajid will do this is partnering with domestic violence shelters or partnering with different therapists in the community to just make sure there are avenues of referrals, so that, you know, again, the problem of like how much we put on imams is like a totally separate one. But the fact that our imams of our community are under so much pressure also to like be counselors and be doctors and be spiritual guides and like I think the list just continues, further requires us as a community to, you know, take the burden off of them a little bit, but also get well equipped with what the resources in our community are and who we can go to for stuff like this. Use religious authority, giving khutbahs on domestic violence to build awareness. Imam Jawad gave a very good khutbah a couple of weeks ago on mental health, which I really appreciated. I hope you do one on this as well. It would be wonderful. Just hint, hint. Oh, great. Excellent. And then, of course, educating our children. All right, next slide. So ways to respond to disclosure as a community. So I think we talked about a code of ethics. We talked earlier about, you know, our religious leadership, unfortunately, not having at the moment like a specific code of ethics or a licensing body that they can report to. Again, none of that is something that we all can do, but what we can advocate for as individual masajid and institutions is to make sure that our own masajid have something like processes and procedures in place for prevention of this kind of harm in our institutions. If someone comes and discloses something like this to you, be victim-centered, meaning don't take matters into your own hands. Figuring out what it is they even want. Some people may just want to share what happened to them, but they do not want to out the person that abused them. And as much as we might want to, again, you can cause more harm by doing that. Believing survivors, so doing your due diligence without shaming or negating their experience. Again, no matter who it is in our community that someone accuses, it is deeply difficult for us to reconcile that someone we look up to, again, whether they're a leader or whether they're a friend or someone that we're family friends with, could commit the harms like this. But we have to recognize that when these things are reported, they are 99% of the time true. There is a 1%, and sometimes other, people will use the 1% to discount survivors of trauma of any kind. But when it's reported, it very overwhelmingly likely is true, especially if children report it, because they don't even have the language oftentimes to recognize what the alternative would be for when they report something like this. Also, having trainings for religious leadership to understand what spiritual abuse and religious trauma is. And then as well, deconstructing our inability as a community to be accepting and compassionate towards survivors, which, in our work, we say it's rooted in the buy-in of the cult personality, which is a different topic for a different day. But it's about recognizing why we as a community who, claims to be very justice-centered and centered towards those who are marginalized or victimized in any way, have such a hard time accepting that this happens. And again, different topic for a different day. And this is never, as always, I keep saying, this is never an attack on our institutions. This is never an attack on our masajid. Our masajid are full of barakah. But the reason this problem exists and why we want to talk about it is because we want to keep them that way. Any objective comparison between any nonprofits or organizations will show different codes of conduct and different ethical guidelines that are in place. And we want to hold our masajid and our institutions to those same standards, if not better, because we hold something much deeper and dearer to our community as a masjid than any random organization. And then ways to heal for survivors. Again, as I mentioned, trauma literally disconnects you from your body. And something like this, especially with religion or faith, will not just disconnect you from your body, but will disconnect you from your faith. It is important to recognize, I think I forgot to mention it on the last slide, but it's important to recognize that oftentimes when someone has dealt with really severe religious trauma by means of clergy abuse, by means of spiritual abuse by a family member, they may often feel disconnected from their faith community for a while. And that's something that's very hard, unfortunately, for their families, their friends, people in their community circle to grapple with. But it is very, very important that we don't shame them, because again, the more you shame people, the more you perpetuate that distance with the faith. And now I'm not saying you condone whatever it is that they do. I'm not saying you condone, if they decide they want to leave Islam. I'm saying you be a supportive person as a human. And many, many times, alhamdulillah, over the years, people come back. And they come back because they have safe people in their lives that help them feel and help them remember that Islam is not this like horrible, awful thing that was okay with what happened to them. Islam is mercy, Islam is justice, Islam is safety. But they have to be able to develop that relationship with the faith again, often through friendships, but also therapy and also safe imams and leaders in their community that also help answer questions and bring them back to the faith. And I know, again, speaking from experience of talking to many survivors, this helps so much. Like just holding space for people is so major because the abuse and the trauma actually took that away from them. Other therapists will do things like breath work, meditation, yoga, and they'll, people, those who practice this and are Muslim will sometimes like merge the two with dua and prayer. It's really interesting. But there are many, many ways to heal, especially in rebuilding a stronger relationship with the faith. So some organizations for religious trauma in the Muslim community, you can screenshot this or take a picture just to look up the organizations because they have some very really good articles to read as well. FACE is the organization I was talking about that I work for, Facing Abuse in Community Environments. There's also the Horma Project by Dr. Ingrid Mattson, if you know who that is. There's In Sheikh's Clothing, Family Youth Institute, Peaceful Families. Faith Trust Institute is not a Muslim specific organization, but I believe it handles religious trauma in all the three Abrahamic faiths. So just really good resources for learning and just to read more. This one I would definitely screenshot as soon as it comes up. Yeah, there we go. These are most of the articles that I pulled from, and they're really, really good and very, very detailed. They're written by a variety of people, including sheikhs, therapists, attorneys, psychiatrists. There's toolkits, there's proposals for ethics for Muslim leadership. It's like a treasure trove of information by people in this field who have been working in it or are adjacent to it somehow about religious trauma in all its forms. So definitely recommend reading some of those. And then finally, some local resources. There's nothing local specifically for religious trauma that I know of, but there are some very good organizations to pay attention to. One is MAPS, which is Muslim Association for Psychological Services, which I'm here representing today, which is a database of Muslim therapists in Texas at the moment. So if you contact MAPS, like overall, like you're not going to hear a response because it's not like a singular organization. It's just a bunch of different people, kind of like in a directory. So if you're ever searching for a Muslim therapist, this is the place to go for sure. You also have the Safe Alliance, AFSA in Austin, SAIVA, which I believe is for South Asians. And then you have Muslim Space, which provides free chaplaincy services to anybody in need. So chaplaincy is kind of somewhere between, maybe Osama can explain it, he's a chaplain, but somewhere between like religious counseling and therapy. And so they offer this free of charge to anybody in the community who needs it, which also is a really, really great resource. And then finally, just to conclude, there we go. Just to conclude, to summarize for today, religious trauma can impact people of all backgrounds and faiths. Religion is not the problem. It is the misuse and abuse of texts, scriptures, and hadith that are taken out of context, as well as an unchecked power differential that causes harm. Religious trauma can happen in familial settings, as well as in religious settings and institutions. And religious trauma can sometimes be unintentional, but it is a collective responsibility on all of us to educate, create awareness, and combat it. And finally, religious trauma is a mental health issue and something that's really relevant in today's time. And that is all I have. So do we have any questions? Yes.
Who is responsible for checking power and control?
So in an ideal world, okay, so let me repeat the question for those on Zoom. So the question was, who is responsible for checking power and control? So in an ideal world, it would be the community itself, the people, right? And so that's why when you think about the way nonprofits are structured, that's why most masajid will have board elections. I think most of the big ones, not all of them. But the community votes a board in that represents them, and the board is responsible for making all the decisions and the financial decisions. But the ultimate power is in the hands of the people. Our institutions are not really run like that, because a lot of people are too busy to be involved, or you have your few volunteers here and there. But you know, in the prophet's time too, like when you think about the masajid and the way that the communities were run, these were very much community spaces where people all came together to have their events and make their decisions, and different people would lead prayer. Like it was very, very communal. And I think a big push for not just leadership accountability but also for community accountability is for having our community be more present, to
So
make those
one more
decisions.
question. The people chosen to check this power and control, will they have to get like the degrees from colleges in order for us to choose them to check power and control? Can a regular person be responsible for checking power and control, or do I have to go get a degree? Do I
Yes.
have to study outside of Islam to be chosen to check power and control, or
Good
can
question.
I get it from the Quran?
Good question. So the question was, do I have to be learned or, have a degree to check power and control? I would say that very much the answer is no. What you really have to have is a sense of ethics and morals and trustworthiness, from the community. That's really it. I mean, you can see like the different, I don't know much about the board members here. Maybe someone else can tell me, but you're not going to see a lot of board members be, like religious authorities. They're going to be like your community accountants and uncles and engineers, and they do all kinds of things, but they really care about the masjid and they're passionate about it. But again, the responsibility of checking power and control, I don't think can be limited to just a degree, because you have people who are religious authorities that also don't really know how to do that, or aren't self-aware enough to be able to recognize that they may be crossing a boundary. And so really what it comes down to is just like regular trainings and understandings of, again, what power and control looks like and what leadership is supposed to be, and also what are the roles of everybody in the institution. Some of us just don't understand that as community members, and thus we're not able to really like pay attention to what's happening, or recognize like, hey, this may be a problem. Like, hey, you should be publishing your financial statements as a masjid like every year. And I have no idea if this is happening or not here, by the way. I'm just saying generally. But these are things that as a community we are supposed to be able to demand. And the leadership is responsible, for being able to create those safe spaces, but we're also responsible for demanding those safe spaces. Yeah, absolutely. Sure. Imam Jawad.
Talk about therefore highlighting the plight of the imams as well, as to how much is on it at the car fix. And,
Oh, have your car fixed. Wow.
yeah, I have done it, but all sorts of cases. Of course, for me personally, one of my biggest concerns is that I don't ever want to say or do anything that would make a person feel like they should not come. Not just my mission, but any mission. So, what would you advise would be the steps that us as a clergy can take to make sure that not only nothing wrong happens, but that nothing is also misunderstood?
Okay, that's a really good question. So for those on Zoom, Imam Jawad asked, what steps would you recommend for clergy to take, so that this unfortunate or unintentional act of someone being deterred from the masjid does not occur. I think I have many different directions I could think of, but I think one thing that might be really helpful, is whether it be khutbas or discussions, or regular sermons that are given to the community. It may be helpful to not screen them with the mental health professional, but perhaps like, have mental health professionals look at them, because Najiha is also in MAPS with me. And one thing we talk about in MAPS is that as well-intentioned as so many khutbas and sermons are, they actually go very far into the shame territory, where they actually create shame in adults, children alike. And again, it's really important to balance that, and increasingly difficult in today's time, right? Where saying something like you will go to hell for X, Y, and Z can mean so much more than what it's intended as, right? And so then you have a culture right now of like instant gratification, and of like, well, I want to believe that X, Y, and Z is right. And so even more now, so like people are having just a very hard time with that. And it's not that we just gloss it and we don't say it, but there are ways to communicate the message that I think don't go into shaming, like shame, which is different from guilt, right? Because guilt is temporary, shame is like inherent.
What I meant was more like personal interaction with
Mhm.
a lot of times a woman who's in a desperate situation
Mhm.
reaching out. Usually for them, a lot of people they don't feel comfortable with therapists or right away.
Yeah.
Coming from certain backgrounds,
Mhm.
there's a lot of stigma.
Mhm. Mhm.
So their first stop is
Right.
and I personally, kind of try to implement that. Hey, look, your problem is not something that I'm thinking you go to the but of course, that also can cause problems. And they're like, what are you saying about me? Or you're not helping me while I'm asking for help. You're not helping.
Yeah.
So, and then people are, like you said, they just want somebody to listen to. I feel like the most of my counseling appointments
Yeah.
are just therapy sessions for people.
Yeah.
My expense. But, Mela accepted from me.
I mean,
But it can be very easily, misunderstood by somebody that, hey, why is my wife keep going to the imam?
Mhm.
Talk with your hand.
Mhm.
Maybe she's desperate at home. No one. So I'm always worried about that. If somebody gets up and says, well, yeah, the imam listens to me like that no one else does, and that could just spark a
create something else.
rumor
Yeah.
stuff like that. So what can we do to not be in that situation
Okay.
as imams?
Yeah. Okay. So I heard two things. One was like, how do we just like serve as good spiritual counselors, but also how do we not cross boundaries, right? So for how to serve as good spiritual counselors, I don't have a specific answer, but I know that there are many trainings now offered to religious leadership that are very, not intensive, very short, like a couple hours at most. Mental health first aid is like a really, really good one. I know the Muslim Mental Health Conference every year has a training for mental health first aid for imams that many really love, and for chaplains as well. Huh? Oh, sorry. And for chaplains as well. And so this doesn't give you necessarily the ability to like really, really go in depth with them, but a lot of people will come to the imam in crisis, right? And it's just like everything is horrible, and I need you to sit down and listen to me, and sometimes just like little skills here and there, and just recognizing also what may be happening in front of you. Um, yeah, the mental health first aid training can be really helpful. As for not crossing boundaries when in religious counseling sessions. There's different things. I would love to send you our face code of conduct because it's like a behemoth of a document. It covers all of this. But one of the things it talks about just very simply is, again, with checks and balances, like having a person or a volunteer or someone in the masjid know that you're in a session, right? So sometimes the imam acts independently, not because they want to, but because everything is so put on them that there's no one to divide up the labor. People have talked about doing like sign-in documents, like you have a sign-in document to talk to the imam, and like a time in and time out that's like given to the office. And so, or even if someone can't be there physically, making sure that someone knows who is seeing the imam at all times and just having documented records of it. And not just that doesn't just create documentation, but it creates safety for the person signing in and for the imam as well. That like if something happens in here, and I'm not believed as an imam, or the person in the office isn't believed, there was documentation here that this at least took place, and we know that this took place. We talk about leaving doors open, and sometimes that can create a privacy issue. So not every masjid is always equipped to have this, but like having the imam's office in a place that's not like smack in the middle of everything, but also in a place that can afford necessary privacy without being in an entirely enclosed room. People talk about, if the office has a window, like leaving the window open if you can't open the door because it's loud. But there are many different ways I think that we can be creative, just to make sure that not only are we protecting people, but we're also protecting imams, because definitely this happens where things are misconstrued, or you have people who are bringing in transference from like their unhealthy relationships. So yeah, it's really about protecting everybody as a whole. I hope that's helpful. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Hmm.
Usually people are really, really sensitive about their privacy. And they don't want
Yeah.
their, the closest friends to know what's going on.
But the big question here is,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think the big question here is, that's what I have been talking with all these moms.
Oh, 100%.
They are
Yeah.
not trained for it.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Even though I have told them, let's stop it. Because you do only what you are. Because at the end of the day, they get so stressed because of these day work long hours. They have a woman to take care of. They can take them on top of the percentage of the set hours.
Yeah.
But it's, I don't think people are getting the signal that, okay, these moms are not set for the, doing the therapy if you outside the religious spectrum.
Right. Yeah. 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 Go ahead.
True. That's true.
Yeah.
I think that's what, sorry, question. That's what is going to happen because I've been talking with our team too. Like once a month is most of you know is this session we have is how can we form a team which is not only going to have an MCC, which is going to have the whole Austin community because every budget does their own programs. How do we come collaborate together, form a team where instead of going to the imam, they go directly to the we, as you said, it's a lack of knowledge. We do have a very, very experienced professional Muslim therapists and all sort of other mental health and
I think, and I started out as a non to get healed from trauma. So for me to talk to an imam who gets instruction from somebody who reads other than the Quran to give me healing from my trauma, it's causing more trauma. Because not coming from Islam into Islam, I know that the Quran itself is the Shifa. If I raise my kids upon the principles that are in the ayah of the Quran, do I have to send them to school for mental health training? If they learn a 40 hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, do they have to go to college to learn how to talk to people, treat people?
Well, that's a really good question. Yeah. So it's really interesting you say that because, and I would love if anyone wants to contribute or answer that as well. But it's, to me, as I hear your question, it's kind of the same idea as a random person like reading the Quran, right? Versus like a religious scholar who trains in the Quran and actually learns how to apply it, right? As a lay person, we may not be religiously or scholarly, we don't have that religious or scholarly training, but we need help in applying a lot of what we're learning as well. And I'm not saying that therapy is like this, super Islamic model, because not all of it is. But therapy will help us, if we do it the right way with the right people, would help us apply a lot of what's in the Quran to our daily life. And again, therapy is not for everyone. So I'm not saying like every single person here needs to go to therapy and must go to therapy. It's not for everybody. And I say this as a therapist. I know people who would not benefit being in therapy. And they have, and furthermore, they have the resources to heal on their own. And that can be Quran and Hadith and religious texts, definitely. But for some people, it's not that it's not enough. It's just that the application doesn't, extend to just reading. They need something more. They need someone to help guide them through it. And so, for example, as a therapist, again, I'm not religiously trained in any way, but I have a lot of Muslim clients. And a lot of the things that, Muslim clients will need or will do is having duas that they really like to read, or they'll talk about a specific Quran verse that really helped them through that week, and we'll process it together, like verses about forgiveness. And I'm like, and I always tell them, like, I'm not a scholar, I'm not religiously trained, I'm a Muslim who's just very passionate, and I'm a therapist. But this verse, here's what it means to me, and here's maybe how it can be applied to you in your context. And a lot of them are struggling with like sins they've committed and just not being able to find forgiveness. And they can read all the ayahs about forgiveness in the Quran, right? But it's just not clicking. And sometimes they need that validation from someone else to be able to really recognize that and understand and absorb what the Quran is trying to tell them. And not, again, as a replacement for religious leadership or scholarship, but as someone to aid them and guide them. And Osama can maybe speak better to this too, because he's a chaplain and he does this all the time. But yeah, go ahead.
I'm just saying, like, even when we recite Al-Fatiha, we say that we seek Allah. So I don't know why the validation doesn't come from the Salah. We tell Allah that we seek Him for help and aid and assistance. So, like I'm saying, I wasn't a Muslim first.
Mhm, mhm,
Now I'm becoming a Muslim.
mhm.
And this is like a part of the trauma I'm facing from becoming a Muslim because outside sources
Mhm,
are infiltrating
mhm.
Islam through education. Like
Yeah.
they're masking it with degrees and doctorates. Like,
Mhm, mhm.
but they're coming in and things are changing inside of the religion. People are changing their viewpoints because
Mhm.
of people who don't care about like if Allah is first, or they don't care about
Yeah.
the messenger. So the
Yeah.
advice that they give
Mhm.
is not geared towards you going to Jannah.
Right.
It might be just you having a smile today or tomorrow.
Yeah.
You know, and
Yeah.
like I'm becoming worried because I want to go to Jannah. You know what I mean? So
Don't we
I'm
all?
like, if these institutions come in, you know, and they start making the rules, that's why I'm asking who checks power and control. An outside religious institution now
No.
checks the power and
No,
control.
absolutely
like,
not.
Says, like, Imam, you talk about this, you say that. You know what happened? What happened to our direct connection with Allah? Like,
Yeah.
what happened to him guiding us?
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing is I have the same question. I'm like, if we have the Quran, right, which teaches us about justice, right? Like, why are we so inherently unjust as people? All of us, even in the Muslim community, which goes to show there is a disconnect between people reading the Quran and reciting it in the khutbahs and all of that and how it's actually being applied. So I'm not saying you're not right, like you're absolutely right. And but that's the problem, right? Is like it's not translating over into action and it's not translating over into how we protect the most vulnerable from harm. And like I said, I can't answer for all the other, issues you mentioned, although they're very important ones. I can say as a therapist, like I never claim to, and as a therapist, as someone who does this work, like I never claim to replace religious authority. I'm not interested in making, haram what is halal or making halal what is haram. I am interested in understanding the Quran and Allah as the divine justice and trying to figure out how we as a community together can implement it and uphold it to the best of our ability and to the best of the prophetic model as much as we understand it.
So maybe just something more to think about from somebody.
Yeah.
You know, from a different perspective.
Absolutely. I appreciate you sharing that.
About Islam, you know, when I get to
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the more I meet people, the more just in today's society, like the outside influences are trying to get people away from religion, you know, like spirituality,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like
It doesn't make sense, yeah.
You know, things are trying to get in, and you're trying to hold on. You know, at the same time, it's like, well, what do I actually do?
Yeah.
You know, so I'm open for the feedback. It's just, I guess I became concerned, you know, a little bit just thinking about it. I want somebody to teach me the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
And this is coming from somebody who wasn't a Muslim.
Yeah.
Because that's my superpower now.
Yeah.
Every time I use the Quran, I've even used it in a workplace. You know, like recited Quran in the workplace, and the people submit to Allah. So I know that the Quran is what, you know, but how to give the Quran to the people? I guess this is what we're doing now. How to give it to the people.
And I mean, and if you want to even think of it like this, I'm trying to phrase this carefully, but like if we just had the Quran, which we do, and it's the most powerful thing in the world, right? Like we would never have other books about it. Like, people have written commentaries on Quran, there's tafsir on Quran, there's interpretations of Quran. Like if it was like there are vehicles in place for understanding the Quran, right? I'm not claiming therapy is one of them, but I'm saying again, for certain things, it's not just that the thing like the guidebook exists, but then there's an explanation of the guidebook. So I kind of think of therapy like that, not in a religious way, but more so from like an emotional and mental health way, and it can very much tie into our faith practice as well.
I hate it, but I see my Imam as my therapist. So I mean, I hate it for you.
Imam Jawad, tell us how you feel about that.
I hate it for you, but I see my Imam, like my Imam tells me something and I trust him already.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm going with.
Yeah, then that's for you. Yeah.
And I'm sorry about that.
You know, I tell you a funny story that one time I got a call for and he said that we need your help. And the funny thing was, I was having that exact same dispute with my wife. So, like, moms are human beings.
Exactly.
They're not the problem. So, look at it this way: that the Quran is a type of therapy.
Mhm.
And your iman is at the level where you can get direct healing.
Mhm.
But a lot of us are not at that level.
Yeah.
We need somebody to kind of, give you the same training. So sometimes a person is not at that level of understanding of the Quran, where they can directly go to the Quran once. So different experts will be the good and the Prophet said that wisdom is the lost item of the business, wherever it comes from. The mental health expert is able to control some wisdom. A non-Muslim person, wherever it comes from, if it's beneficial, take it to the
Yes. Mhm.
This site content based on physical
Mm.
abuse that goes through in physical.
Mhm.
And there's not a lot that goes on mental abuse
Mm.
that a lot of people.
Yeah.
So how local resources that we handle mental abuse. And I feel like a lot of physical abuse comes from somebody who's mentally ill.
Definitely.
Right? So I feel like there's not a lot that's covered at the source of why all this is happening.
Yeah.
It's a lot about how you can fix things or where you can go and all of that.
Yeah.
But then there's a fundamental problem. And I feel like I don't want to honor it much about, but I feel like a lot of discuss about how we need to pray so much and how we can do all these physical acts of worship. There's less of content about
Yeah.
how you need to do proper character building.
Yes.
That's what my life
Yeah, it's not so much about the moral content.
Yeah.
It's so much about like the whole literature series. Like people talk, imams talk about it. Anyway, not just imams spirit. So like you do fasting, do charity. These are all physical acts of purifying yourself.
Yeah.
It's not so much about mental acts of
Yeah.
yourself. And I feel like it's the of the lack of, people are communicating this now.
Absolutely.
So when you go to a therapist, how much is this taken serious? I mean, honestly, there's a physical
Yeah.
so you react to it.
No, therapists are trained to really understand emotional and mental abuse. We call that just like, I think like there's many different names for it, but we'll call that the hidden abuse. Like it's the thing you can't see. There's no screenshots or pictures of bruises or anything like that. But like anyone who's trained and compassionate can see just the damage to the soul that it does and the damage to someone's faith, for example. So I know there actually were a few examples of emotional abuse, but again, there's so much overlap, right? So an example that I think I gave was like forcing someone to wear the hijab, right? Like there's a spiritual component, there's also an emotional component because as much as this is the right thing, it's not where they're meant to be at. And so they can't feel fully bought into it if they're forced into it, right? And again, wearing the hijab is really important, and I believe in it. But like you accomplish absolutely nothing by forcing it on someone, right? And so there was stuff like that. There was stuff about like I'm like blanking a little bit, but like forcing someone to just engage in a certain kind of worship or have many children, for example, and saying that like this is the decree. So again, you never lay a hand on this person, but you have created this dynamic where not only are you the one interpreting the Quran for your spouse, but then you're also enforcing it, and it's not even correct or real, right? And so all these things can happen without someone ever laying a hand on anyone. And we see this with like spiritual abuse in religious settings as well. Like I've literally heard people say like my imam literally said that I got a revelation from God that I was supposed to marry you secretly in this hotel. Like I wish I could make this up. I'm not, right? But like he never laid a hand on her. I mean, like not physically. But even claiming that authority and oftentimes the victims who fall into this are mentally ill themselves or deeply vulnerable and really like come to revere this person as like a saint, which doesn't really exist, right? And so it's like the perfect combination of like the most disastrous elements. Like you have someone who's already vulnerable, you have somebody in power, and they never have to lay a hand on them. You can just manipulate them enough to where they they see you as this like all authoritative figure because you may have the Quran or you may have little miracles that happen here and there that you engineer. And then before you know it, you have this person who is like fully in your enthrall. And again, it sounds like a conspiracy theory. It's not. I wish it was. But this is literally how people, this is why power and control and understanding it is so important, not just in the context of physical abuse, but also for emotional and mental abuse. And it goes over into psychological and it goes into spiritual. So really it, like, I think they show these things as like a circle where you have these pieces of a pie. It should really be like a big Venn diagram because all of this overlaps with each other. You rarely ever have one without the other.
Still extreme case. I'm just talking about
Yeah.
general stuff like
Yeah.
you can find people,
Mhm.
find partners,
Yeah.
casting, voluntary casting.
Mhm.
But then if here, why?
Yeah.
I mean, I can't understand how do you make this person bridge the gap between
Yeah.
fulfilling physical worship that mentally or somewhere else.
Yeah.
Because actually worship are not in the name.
Right.
And I see that in so many different places. Like, I think it's easier to humans to practice, these things that, like, say, about states in this focus. But when you go to global practice with the other issues, like all these things not being so good, that takes a backseat.
Yeah.
Because you now have to deal with other things, and you're like, oh, I can't do this idea.
Yeah.
I'm guilty of that myself.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I find a lot of that doesn't happen with my music. Problems with all the connected work in those circles.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, I know that I talk about it a lot, there's problems in other parts of the Muslim world, but we just try to work in our own circle. And I think that goes to a little bit, my personal focus is always about behavior, character, things like that. I would take small attention to one thing that maybe you want to rephrase, which is that if there is someone
Mhm.
it needs to go to the right must perhaps find the guidance there. Maybe this is not the right behavior or the right. We don't want to say that, well, if you're being what are you doing? Say that if you are sick, you need to be in a hospital.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I meant they shouldn't be in leadership, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say that, sometimes I feel like, okay, I'm giving all this stuff, but I'm not a person.
Right.
Should I stop giving stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Or should I try to practice what I preach to the best of my ability? So I think that if we would give Shaitan a victory if we pass that narrative that hey, you're doing one bad thing, stop doing the other good that you're doing.
Right. I see what you're saying.
But rather try to increase the good or decrease the bad. Even if you can't increase the good, decrease the bad.
Yeah.
So I think that our massage should have a focus on that. Sometimes in my whether I say exactly this, I'm like, how could you be, you're praying, you're fasting, you're doing all this, but how can you not understand the relationship between that and your behavior at home?
Right.
And especially the hadith of the Prophet, that the best of you are the ones who best.
Definitely.
If you can convince the whole world that you're a good person, it happens that you're not a good person. You're not a good person. End of discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm glad you said that. I think what I specifically was thinking about was, people who have very like openly and explicitly violated their position, like an actual leadership position, but then I can't talk about whether they're invited back to the masjid just as a congregant because I'm like, I think everyone has a right to be at the masjid unless you're like a physical like threat or danger. And even then that's, there's nuances, but it's like they'll install him back in the same leadership position of like teaching and khutbahs and things like that, where he actually, huh? No, I mean, it would be shaming and ostracizing, in my opinion, if they were just banned from the masjid outright. But, someone like, again, with like the same example of like if you're a medical professional, and I know like it doesn't translate in the same way, but like if you're given a position of trust and authority and you violate it, and I don't mean in like a little way, like I mean you violate it in a really major way. And I don't want to give examples, but like after that, at least I think, and how I understand it too, is like you just lose that authority of trust ever. And maybe there are different populations you can work with and things like that. But even then, if it's escalated to like sexual assault, like you are forever like a threat. Like I'm sorry,
Sorry,
you know?
I definitely,
Yeah.
anybody who violates the public relation,
Yes.
they should be blacklisted from public,
Exactly.
or
Yes.
if not forever, for a while.
Yes.
But if someone has, let's say they're like a board member that is very active in helping,
Hmm.
donating,
Hmm.
like that, and they have a personal case of being
Yeah.
um, would I'm not, I don't know the answer, but I wonder if it is not shaming or ostracizing or loss of reputation for that person.
Hmm.
Also, like if they have corrected that behavior and they have stopped,
Yeah.
do they always have to remain blacklisted?
Oh no.
Independent of their crime.
Yeah, yeah, no. So I definitely, just as an individual, I very much believe in restorative justice, and I think Islam is a religion of restorative justice, right? But like what you're speaking of is a very ideal situation that just doesn't happen in our communities. I wish it did. Yeah, but like we create this culture of like it's okay, it's happening at home, and like what's happening at home is not our business, but like it is our business, right? And so like yes, I agree with you. Like if someone has actually corrected their behavior and taken the proper necessary steps, there have to be avenues in place to rebuild that trust. But like actually rebuild it, right? It's never, no one ever takes that route to rebuild it. They just install him and then tell the community to deal with it. And that's where the problem is. And I think again, this is all that conversation about power and control and checks and balances and the community being involved and like actually knowing what's happening with their leadership, which is just a whole different topic for a different day, I think. But no, I don't think like, I don't think someone who has committed like a minor violation or struggles with different issues, and again not individual private sins, like if you're a board member and you have an alcohol problem, like yeah, there's an issue, but like that's not my problem as a person, right? Like yeah, I think you should get help. But yeah, I do have a problem with it if you're, a board member, and maybe you stole my zakat money, like that's that's pretty major. And so yeah, we could talk nuance and all of that all day, but to answer your question, yeah, I do think there should definitely be avenues of, um, bringing people back, but first we have to take accountability, and we're barely there yet. So
Do you
yeah.
have time?
I do.
I was just gonna say that when I was first learning, I heard working father if you agree to tell a lie, they wouldn't accept. Just I mean using that like if you have bad character, then or you shouldn't be put in a position where you can regulate or have character if you yourself have
Hmm.
bad character.
Yeah.
I mean, there is retribution, but if your bad character is the first thing that's at the people's mind, gotta fix that first. So they feel like, there's no bad character.
Definitely imams would be like character,
Yeah.
not board members and not necessarily.
Right. Hmm.
Except it starts at home with your family first, right?
It
Hmm.
does, yes.
Yeah. And it comes back down, right, to like the idea that not only are imams supposed to be the best of character, but then we put too much on them. And then like how do you maintain the best of character when you have the entire community's pressure on your shoulders,
Yeah, my
right?
wife might say that,
Yeah.
give us enough time.
Yeah, yeah. And so it's twofold, right? Like I don't ever want it to sound like, oh, the responsibility is entirely on the leadership. The responsibility is on all of us as a community to recognize the role that our leaders play, and then to also step up and take more of a role ourselves. We're not just innocent bystanders. Like we all have a duty to our community and our masjids and our like our faith. And we have to be more active participants in that.
I think it's more like kind of an
Hmm.
They are the moms, they are the scholars, but
Yes.
also at the end of the day, they are human.
Yep,
We
absolutely.
need to give them that privacy, okay? Isha is the limit. Don't call them with eyes. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter how like an emergency you have, but
Right.
they have their personal life too.
Right.
And on me as a personal now, I try to really implement it, but I think it can happen, but guys as a mental health professional and also the just have that. If it's out there set hours for outside that is it's just like going to the doctor.
Yeah,
You cannot call doctor anytime you want.
some people try,
Unless,
but yeah.
unless there is somebody is
On call, yeah. Like there are people to handle crisis stuff,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. So which is, I think that's what needs to happen too. It needs to have that crisis management. Stuff like that. But
Yeah,
it's a long term. But it needs to be like, but it needs to like it should not be just a one budget. I always think about it. That collaboration.
right.
It's when we all come together that awareness is automatic.
Absolutely. Yeah. Did you want to add anything?
I would just say that, stemming from a question there, the dynamic of how the facility works is very community centered. Since we do have leadership, we do have the structure, but in terms of people feeling safety, people, the types of screenings that you can have where oftentimes people will go to any and everything to the
Right.
whether it's auto mechanic issues, like you mentioned, or whether it's anything else, coming in a space there. But I feel like we talked about how there is a definite emphasis absolutely on like the ritual and how to practically perform Islam. And I don't know in terms of the emotional intelligence that when someone, if I go into the masjid right now and go pray and I roll up my pants up to my knees, somebody's gonna come on my shoulder and say, brother, lower it down. They'll be able to spot where I haven't done this right. But if I'm sitting at the back of the corner, my eyes are full of tears, most people might just look at me and be like, right, yeah, unless they know me, they'll be like, I don't know, I don't want to get near that. But I think in the same way we kind of have to train people to say, this is the way we practice our faith, this is the way you read the Quran. If I hear somebody say something wrong in prayer, I'll say subhanAllah. Like I'll be trained to be able to at least help out in this in different ways and to be on my guard when it comes to my faith. But when it comes to just emotional intelligence, if I see my brother not, something may not be well, something may not be, all that right, at least in terms of just being able to extend and approach that person, but also understanding for you, whether you are that imam or you are that person who is just another brother in the masjid, or you're the mental health professional, what is your limitation? And I think that's the other thing in terms of like, what is our limit? That I'm helping you in crisis. Do I have to be the person that gets you from start all the way to finish? Or at what point can I walk alongside you to the imam's office? And at what point can the imam take you to where they need to go? But I really think outside of the leadership or the board, I think a lot of the effect that happens in the terms of mental health areas and abuses and whatnot happens in the community just at large. And what can be trained as far as being just as good with respect to our salat, with respect to our adat, what can happen with respect to our
Yes.
emotional intelligence, our character,
Mhm.
and how just as we're vigilant here, can we be helpful in that area as well?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good reminder. Mhm.
But I think that would be like helpful. Have the infectious groups.
Yeah.
That knowing
Yeah.
options.
Yeah. I think there's like a social services team here or something, but I don't remember what the specific program is, but someone was telling me that they work with victims of violence or those who are coming here for masjid help or something. Like there's a committee here that like handles that. And so yeah, even having them trained would be like, something. I think so. Maybe, yeah.
We have a hack team.
Yeah, exactly.
Hack team where by online or the form here, they give a form, what kind of financial needs they have, and then
Yeah.
we have a basis.
Yeah. System is, yeah. Yeah, I'm sure.
But
Yeah,
anybody have any other questions or if you have another
yeah,
our
I'll just look one thing, I've seen that some other spaces that front and center, or other areas that they're encountering some issues with it on the website or wherever it is. The first thing they see when they have some kind of issue says, who should you see for? Or when should you see so and so? And it has, if you are experiencing this, and it has the people who are trained for that area, but nevertheless you can't sometimes reprogram someone's presets who will automatically go to
the
a
imam,
spiritual
yeah,
care leader, an imam, or whoever. And I think a lot of that, in the sense of building that limitation with respect, like, hey, just giving a preface, like, I'm happy to have that conversation. You may be experiencing an extremely severe depressive episode. I can sit with you, we can talk, but let's just make sure pretty clear.
yeah,
I'm not the last stop on this journey.
Yeah.
I'm going to walk with you as long as you need, but
Mhm.
the help that you'll need to kind of get along the line is this next step. Even if you don't want to go to, even if you don't have the means right now, but I think just instilling that aspect of what is our limit that
Yeah.
we can help with, but also in terms of that collaboration, uplifting the people who aren't. I think making these services accessible, because mental health is just like many other forms of healthcare, is kind of hard to access.
Yeah.
As a masjid, is there a community fund for people who can't access therapy to be able to access these funds if they need a few sessions or subsidies or things like that. But for the imam or for the leadership of the board to think creatively, how can we help? Because we see a lot of people coming with mental health issues to the imam. The imam is already overwhelmed with other things.
Yeah.
How can we help as a community to support these people to say, hey, if you have a barrier of just getting there, we have South Asian or Muslim or any kind of therapists. Here's how we can at least help you cover
Yeah.
the first 2-3 sessions or whatever it is, just to kind of get.
Yeah, and I'm absolutely even like willing to believe that, imams who maybe respond like in a really negative way to people who come for like domestic violence or whatever, I would like I want to attribute that also to like potential burnout or just like not being properly trained or not even knowing how to handle it and being like, what do you want me to do exactly? And so yeah, I think it just comes down to like really being creative as masajid and institutions of like how do we outsource all these people that will come to the masjid for help as like this center community point, but make sure that we have the strong referral networks in place to make sure they get somewhere and can afford it and can have support around it, which is just a big long conversation. Yeah, this was really great. I'm so glad we did this in person. Alhamdulillah. I think it was such a good discussion. And, please forgive me if I said anything that was harmful or offensive. Anything good that was from Allah, anything, negative that I said was from me and from Shaitan. And I really appreciate everybody being here. And I just hope we can continue this conversation because I think it definitely should not stop here. Jazakallah khair, everyone.